invite you to bow your heads. Heavenly Father, as we come into thy sermon time now, please send your Spirit to be with us and bless us as we consider some important things in your word. For Christ's sake, amen. 2 weeks ago, I did a first part in a series on the Second Coming. It was entitled The Second Coming Revisited Part 1. Today we're going to do Part 2, and next time I'm here we'll do Part 3. And it sort of seems appropriate to talk about the Second Coming on this day because the Seventh-day Adventist Church, even in our name, is about Advent, is about the Second Coming of Christ. And really, the church was created based on the hope and sure coming of Jesus Christ at the second time. Now, when I was here last time, I detailed 5 things the New Testament says about the second coming. Firstly, it asserted that Jesus would come a second time just as he left the first time. Second thing, we discovered that it's a worldwide event, not a local incident. Thirdly, that no one knows exactly when he's going to come. Fourthly, there will be signs before he comes again. And finally, we will meet Jesus in the air. He will not land on the earth. Now that was a topical sermon. We looked at the subject matter. But today, I'm going to get, the term is exegete, but we're going to get right into a passage of Scripture. And it's a very well-known one to Adventists, and that is Matthew 24. I want to get right into this passage, and this is going to involve the following. Firstly, who wrote the book, and what was its purpose and theme? What is it really talking about? And what, spelt badly, did it mean to the people back then? And finally, what does it mean to us now? And it's my hope that this study will strengthen our faith into the second coming and will encourage us all to do more study on this very important topic. Now let's briefly look at the book of Matthew. But there's no definitive proof, but most scholars agree that the book was written by the disciple Matthew, probably about AD 50. Now, when you ask most people who their favourite gospel writer is, most people say who? John. Yes, John is the beloved, and it's the one that most people turn to. Michael Green has suggested that the Gospel of Matthew is perhaps the most important single document in the New Testament, for in it we have the fullest and most systematic account of the birth, life, teaching, death and resurrection of the founder of Christianity, Jesus the Messiah. And that's not surprising, because what was Matthew's profession? What was he? Tax collector, which means he was what? He was the most efficient person on earth. He was an accountant. All right? Is that right? All right. So it's not surprising that we see in Matthew, the tax collecting accountant, that we see a systematic presentation of the gospel. Frank Calhoun has said, when comparing the gospels, says the following about Matthew. In Matthew, we see Jesus in his messianic role as the promised king, fulfilling the gospel, fulfilling the Jewish scriptures. So the first purpose of Matthew was to present Jesus in his role as the Messiah. It's interesting that in Matthew's gospel, he quotes 60 times from the Old Testament. So Matthew is an important document. A second purpose of Matthew was to present the significant events in the life of Jesus from his birth to his death and his resurrection. The Gospel presents the essential outline of Christ's life in the context of growing antagonism on the part of the Jewish leaders and developing faith among the disciples. And there was a final purpose of Matthew, and that was to provide a teaching manual for the Christian community. In this role, Matthew became the first systematizer of Jesus' teachings. This is well exemplified by the stress placed on teaching in the Great Commission, where Jesus' final command to his followers was to go and do what? Make disciples of all nations, teaching them to obey everything. To make teaching easier, Matthew arranged materials in a way that made memorization easier. A good example of Matthew's technique is the genealogy that begins in the Gospel. Have you ever studied that? Have you looked at the numerical systematization of that? It has 3 groups of how many names? Have you ever sat there during a boring sermon, I shouldn't say that, and actually counted how many generations there are between each gap? there's three groups of 14 names. And the number 14 is the numerical significance of David's name in Hebrews. As mentioned before, it seems evident that the Gospel was written before the fall of Jerusalem, which occurred in AD 70. This is important, particularly in our study of Matthew 24. Now, Matthew's Gospel is divided into three sections. From chapter 1 to chapter 4:17, it focuses on Jesus the Messiah. From chapter 4:17 to chapter 16, it focuses on the proclamation of Jesus the Messiah. And finally, from chapter 16:21 to the end of the book, the focus is on the suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Okay, we now want to move briefly onto the context of Matthew 24. Now, as it can be seen by that, Matthew 24 during the death and resurrection focus of Jesus. In Matthew 16, Jesus had foretold his death, and this seems to set the tone for the rest of Matthew. In Matthew 19 and 20, Jesus made a trip from Galilee to Jerusalem. And in Matthew 19 and 20, these are the things that happened. There's confrontations with friends. There's confrontations with enemies. There's arguments or confrontations between the disciples. There's the blessing of children. There's the telling of parables. There's further predictions in relation to his death. There's the healing of two blind men. There's Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. There's the casting out of moneylenders from the temple. There's healing of people. There's the cursing of the fig tree. There's confrontations in relation to the authority of Jesus. There's the parable banquet, which I preached on some time ago, and there's confrontations with religious leaders whom Jesus leaves speechless. So you can see in that, one constant word coming up is the word confrontation. It was a very tense and difficult time. Now, the immediate setting of Matthew 24 is in the setting of the temple. Jesus tells them to observe the things that the scribes and Pharisees do, but tells them not to do as they do. He also gives some specific instructions for his own followers. He then refers or mentions a series of woes or judgments against the leaders. Finally, Matthew 24 opens with Jesus leaving the temple for the last time. Now, I'd like you to turn in your Bibles to Matthew 24 because we're going to be referring to it a bit today. Jesus, at the start of the chapter, makes a very definite statement about the temple. I want you to please turn to Matthew 24, verse 2. But he told them, "Do you see all these buildings? I assure you they will be so completely demolished that not one stone will be left on top of another." Now, a little while later, while they are sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples ask him some questions. Now, let's have a look at verse 3. Later, Jesus sat on the slopes of the Mount of Olives. His disciples came to him privately and asked, "When will all this take place? Will there be any sign ahead of time to signal your return at the end of the world?" So in summary, there's three important questions the disciples are asking. Firstly, when will the temple be destroyed? What will be the sign of the return? And what will be the sign of the end of the world? Now, it's interesting. What do you notice about these questions? The first one is specifically addressing the destruction of the temple, whilst the last two refer to what event? End of the world. So we've got these two issues. We've got the destruction of the temple and we've got the second coming. Now, what the disciples are doing here is that they are assuming that the destruction of the temple and the end of the world are the one events that will occur at the same time. Now, I don't know what you discussed in your lesson today, but in our lesson, which was led very well by Violet, we talked about the temple and its destruction, because it was specifically mentioned in Micah. But to the Jews back then, the temple was the epicentre of their culture and their earthly existence. It was impossible for them to think of a world without the temple. Now, what would be the equivalent in other places today? In the United States, what would you think would be the epicentre of the culture or everything that happens in the United States? White House, absolutely. What about in England? What would you think? House of Parliament or Buckingham Palace? Now, I was thinking, what would you say would be the epicentre of culture and all activity in Melbourne? I agree. Absolutely. It would be the MCG. So can you imagine if the MCG was bombed today or was suddenly destroyed, what impact would that have upon Melbourne society? It would be catastrophic. Well, this is what the disciples were referring to. If there was no temple in Jerusalem, society, as they thought, would be absolutely over. Now, it's interesting. When Jesus answers the questions, he actually does some very interesting things. He does not correct the disciples' mistake about mixing the two events together. And he really doesn't answer their questions in a clear way. George Knight points out that his answer mixes the two events and their signs to such an extent that it is well nigh impossible to disentangle them. The result has been a chapter that has proven very difficult to interpret. D.A. Carson has pointed out that few chapters of the Bible have called forth more disagreement among interpreters than Matthew 24. The problems are not simply ones based on different views of the second coming. They seem to be built into the very structure of the chapter itself, and they seem to be deliberate. So the really interesting question now is, why would Jesus, the master teacher and the master storyteller, present us with such an apparent, garbled, confusing lesson? Now, there is no definitive answer to this, but some suggestions are as follows. Jesus does not want to tell us when God will come so as to alert us that we must live in a state of continual expectancy. If he gave us definitive answers as to when he was coming, what would our natural reaction as human beings be? We'd do as we want until the time came for us to actually get our acting together, and then we'd prepare for the second coming. Now, this is exemplified by the parable of the 10 virgins, which happens in Matthew 25. What does Jesus meaning with that parable? That we have to be what? Have our lamps ready continually, because we don't know when he's going to come. And the very lack of a definitive answer leads the readers to continually rethink the teachings regarding the second coming as we attempt to understand what he's talking to about. What Jesus wanted for us is to be so interested in the second coming that we're constantly focusing on it, watching it, and be ready for it, rather than focusing on what and when. He wants us to reflect upon the concept. Now, I want to analyse the chapter and see if we can determine which event, in which verses in the chapter are we talking about. Firstly, let's have a look at Matthew 24, verses 1 to 4. Matthew 24, 1 to 4. What are we talking about here? We're talking about the temple. So Matthew 24, 1 to 4, we're talking about the destruction of the temple. From Matthew 24, 4 to 14, we then talk about the signs of the events to come. And you're all very familiar with these, and they're up on the PowerPoint here. We've got false messiahs, wars, famines, earthquakes, persecutions, false prophets, lawlessness, the lack of an enduring faith, and preaching of gospel to the whole world. Now, the interesting thing is, do these signs apply to the destruction of Jerusalem or to the second coming, or do they refer to both? And this is an important question, and we're going to come back to that in a few minutes. I want you to turn in your Bibles now to Matthew 24, verses 15 to 20. Matthew 24, 15 to 20. The time will come when you will see what Daniel the prophet spoke about, a religious object that causes desecration standing in the holy place. Reader, pay attention. Then those in Judea must flee to the hills. A person outside the house must not go inside to pack. A person in the field must not return even to get a coat. How terrible it will be for pregnant women and for mothers nursing their babies in those days. And pray that your flight will not be in winter or on the Sabbath. Now, the featured phrase in these few verses is the abomination of desolation, and it seems to be specifically referring to the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, there are a number of interpretations in relation to these verses. However, the context seems to be coming from Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. And the context of both Daniel 9 and Matthew 25 would suggest the view that these verses refer to the actions of the zealots. Christians did not suffer the same fate as those Jews who had rejected Jesus as the Messiah. Christians had the counsel of Christ that we found in Matthew 24. Verses 15 to 22 appear to be specifically directed toward the fall of Jerusalem and give directions for when Christians were to make their escape. Now please note the following in history. In August of AD 66, Cestius, who was Rome's legate in Syria, attacked Jerusalem, and then he withdrew for some unknown reason, even though victory was within his grasp. Then in AD 67 and 68, Vespasian subdued Galilee and Judea. But ironically, he delayed the siege of Jerusalem because Nero, the emperor, died. It was not until the spring and summer of AD 70 that Jerusalem was put under siege and destroyed by Vespasian's son Titus. Somehow in the interval between the trouble of AD 66 and the destruction of AD 70, Eusebius tells us that the members of the Jerusalem church, by means of an oracle given by revelation to acceptable persons, were ordered to leave the city before the war began in earnest and settle in a town in Perea called Pella. So it's interesting. Those Christians who followed the warnings of Christ in Matthew 24 and the unnamed prophet noted by Eusebius fled the city and avoided its destruction. Both that destruction and the salvation of Christians from the catastrophe were signs of great significance concerning the second coming of Jesus and the end of the world. So isn't it interesting? Those Christians that read Matthew 24 and Jesus' warnings were able to escape the destruction of Jerusalem. I move on to Matthew 24, 36 to 39. Matthew 24, 36 to 39. However, no one knows the day or the hour when these things will happen, not even the angels in heaven or the Son himself. Only the Father knows. When the Son of Man returns, it will be like it was in Noah's day. In those days, before the flood, the people were enjoying banquets and parties and weddings right up to the time Noah entered his boat. People didn't realise what was going to happen until the flood came and swept them all away. That is the way it will be when the Son of Man comes. Now, interestingly, last Saturday night we had a games evening here, which I enjoyed, and I went home and I was going to go to bed, but I turned the television on. And there was a movie there that I've seen a number of times, the movie 2012. Who's seen the movie 2012? You know, whenever I watch that movie, I get very scared because it really talks about the end of the world and about building these incredible arks. I find it a very scary, poignant movie about what's going to happen. God has already destroyed this earth once, didn't he, by flood? And he's going to do it again, and he's going to come again. So that movie really does something for me. Verse 21 says there will be a time of... So what these verses in 36, 39 are saying is that no one knows specifically when the Son of Man will return. So these verses seem to be specifically talking about the end of the world and the second coming. Now that leaves Matthew 24, 21 to 35, which we talked about earlier. Verse 21 of Matthew 24 tells us there will be a time of great horror or tribulation more than anything the world has ever seen. Now the big question is, when does this horror occur? Is it in relation to the destruction of the temple or Jerusalem, or is it talking about events leading up to the second coming? The verse above reflects and quotes Daniel 12:1. Daniel 12:1, it says, there will be a time of tribulation which has not been seen from the time that there was a nation on earth until that time. Now the context of this verse in Daniel is Daniel 11:40 to 12:2. We are told in these verses that there will be a time of unparalleled tribulation. Michael the prince will stand up on behalf of his people and will save everyone who is found written in the book. This is followed in verse 2 by the resurrection of the dead. Therefore, it seems that the emphasis has changed from the destruction of Jerusalem to the end of the world. Now, verses 22 to 26 have been applied by commentators to both the destruction of Jerusalem and events connected with the second coming, while verses 27 and 28 seem to refer to the second coming. And verses 29 to 31 are universally seen as a description of events leading up to the second coming. Now, verses 32 to 35, however, are a problem. The parable of the fig tree is introduced to illustrate the seriousness of what Jesus has been saying. Verse 33 says that whenever you see these things, know that it is near, even at the door. And this is followed by verse 34, which says, truly I say to you, this generation will not come to an end until all these things happen. It would therefore seem that verses 21 to 31 focus on the second coming, but so do verses 32 to 35. The only issue is that it says that these things are going to occur before this generation passes away. Now, given that 2,000 years have passed since this statement was made, it would seem that Jesus was mistaken if we believe that these verses refer to the second coming. Now, the question is therefore, what are all these things which are to take place before this generation comes to an end? Although the section immediately before these verses would suggest the second coming, Jesus is in fact responding to a question posed to him by the disciples. The context in verses 1 to 3 is the destruction of Jerusalem, and therefore it would seem that the focus of these verses 32 to 35 is about that. In essence, we have the following. The disciples ask, when will these things, the destruction of the temple, occur? Jesus responds, this generation will not come to an end before all these things happened. By contrast, in regard to their second question concerning the second coming, Jesus, no one knows of the day or the hour when this will happen. So he was quite clear. The destruction of Jerusalem will happen in your lifetime, but the second coming, we don't know. No one knows except the Father. And this seems to demonstrate quite interestingly how these two concepts are entangled within the one chapter. Therefore, it would seem logical to say that Jesus was not mistaken. Although the order of the elements in chapter 24 alternates back and forth between two distinct and separate events, this is not such a strange phenomenon when he's trying to answer distinct and separate questions. So that leaves us to answer, what do the verses Matthew 24, 4 to 14 refer to, which we referred to earlier? Verses 4 to 8 seem to focus on events re the destruction of Jerusalem because of two literary cues. In verse 6 we are told that the end is not yet, suggests the section is not focusing on the end of the world. Further, it states in verse 8 that all these things are only the beginning of birth pains. Again, there is the connection with verses 1 to 3 and the destruction of Jerusalem by the phrase, all these things. The opposite seems to be the case for verses 9 to 14. In verse 9 we hear about horror or tribulation, which is connected to events leading up to the second coming. This is further confirmed by use of the term the end in verses 13 and 14, in connection with the one who endures to the end and the preaching of the gospel to the whole world before the end comes. In summary, the structure of Matthew 24 appears to be the following. Matthew 24, 1 to 3, we have three questions. Matthew 24, 4 to 8, we have talks about the destruction of Jerusalem. Matthew 24, 9 to 14 is talking about the second coming. 24, 15 to 20 is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Matthew 24, 21 to 31 is talking about the second coming. Matthew 24, 36 to 39 is talking about the second coming. And Matthew 24, 40 onwards, it's about the epilogue, and it's saying, be ready for the second coming. In summary, the term this generation has created a range of issues. If it refers to the second coming, then Jesus was mistaken. It would seem then that from the analysis of the text that this phrase specifically refers to the destruction of the temple, which was asked by the disciples. It would therefore seem that Matthew 24 is neatly divided into alternating sections. On the one hand, it talks about the destruction of Jerusalem, and then it turns to talking about both the destruction of Jerusalem and the second coming. Now, apart from the issue of the questions that the disciples have posed, the other major feature of the chapter is the signs. And this we as Seventh-day Adventists have mostly focused on. One of the key parts of the disciples' question to Jesus at the start of the chapter is, what will be the signs for the destruction of Jerusalem, the second coming, and the end of the world. Now, Jesus gives them a long list of signs beginning in verse 5. The simple fact in relation to these signs is that they don't give us much specific information about the end of the age. It's interesting. In all of history, there have always been false messiahs. We've had constant earthquakes. We've had a lot of famines, and we have wars every few years. Verse 6 says that these signs should not alarm us, but the end is not yet. In other words, they are signs that the end is coming, but they are not real signs that the end is fast approaching. Each of these signs is a remembrance that the faithful covenant-keeping God has not yet finished the plan of salvation. Each of these signs is a promise that Christ will come again to complete the saving of his people from their sins. A bit like the rainbow after the flood. What did the rainbow indicate? That there would be no more worldwide flood. It was a sign. It would seem, however, that there are 3 signs in Matthew 24 that are much more precise in their connection to the second coming. The first one is found in verse 14. If you've got your Bibles, Matthew 24, verse 14. The good news about the kingdom will be preached throughout the whole world so that all nations will hear it, and finally the end will come. So, the first sign is that the gospel preached to the whole world. Now, it's interesting. Since the birth of modern missions 200 years ago, Christianity has become the most outreach-oriented of all faiths. And it would seem that only when the church has completed its world mission of evangelisation will the second coming no longer be delayed. And if there's one thing the Seventh-day Adventist Church is all about, it's about mission, is it not? We are heralds or evangelists. The second concrete sign is found in verse 27. Matthew 24, verse 27. Let's read that one. For as the lightning lights up the entire sky, so it will be when the Son of Man comes. So we've got the second sign as lightening up the whole sky. Number 3 is the only sign that is actually called a sign in Matthew 24, and it is found in verses 30 and 31. And then at last the sign of the coming of the Son of Man will appear in the heavens, and there will be deep mourning among all the nations of the earth. And they will see the Son of Man arrive on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with the sound of a mighty trumpet blast, and they will gather his chosen ones from the farthest ends of the earth and heaven. Now, once again, as per the previous sign, this is not a sign of the nearness of Jesus coming, because it's going to occur just as Jesus comes in the clouds with power and great glory. Thus, the pattern of Matthew 24 appears to be that the real signs are not signs of nearness, but signs of coming. The majority of the chapter focuses on the less precise signs, which are stated to encourage believers to keep watching, waiting, and working. Now, in conclusion, I hope you've been able to see and appreciate what an interesting chapter Matthew 24 is. Its purpose is to specifically answer the questions posed by Jesus in relation to the destruction of Jerusalem, the second coming. As mentioned before, the disciples mixed or combined these two events, even though it is clear they are separate. Interestingly, deliberately, Jesus does not correct their mistake, but talks about both events and provided very good commentary about both. Due to Matthew 24, many Christians were able to avoid the crisis of the destruction of Jerusalem, and we now who are waiting for the second coming are provided with a litany of signs and warnings that God has left us, so that we can be a state of readiness and be watchful and alert. Now, in terms of the chapter, there are a number of important lessons and affirmations of faith that can be learned. Firstly, that the return of Christ will be personal as well as certain. Number 2, history is going somewhere. It is not meaningless, random, or eternal, nor is it an endless cycle. There will be a real end, just as there was a real beginning. At the end, we shall find none other than Jesus Christ. Point 3, the return of Christ points to the triumph of good over evil, the triumph of God's purpose over human and cosmic rebellion. 4, the return spells restoration. There will be a new creation, a new heaven and a new earth. in which only goodness dwells. Fifthly, the return of Jesus points to judgment and separation. I have to tell you, some are going to be taken and some are going to be left. Sixthly, the return of Jesus will be decisive. Singling the end of the age, it ushers in the fullness of the kingdom. The time for repentance and change will be forever past. 7, the return will be as sudden and unexpected as a flash of lightning in the sky. It will come out of the blue to a world that is not expecting it. And finally, the return of Jesus will come at a time only known to God the Father. In the meantime, Christians are to be faithful, even in the face of hardship, and watchful as they wait for the return of Jesus. This is the real message of Matthew 24. We must be watchful and alert. Now, as we're celebrating the 150th anniversary or commemoration of the beginning of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, it's my prayer today that we will heed the warnings and messages of this chapter. We will get our own house in order and we will spread the positivity of this message to others. It is my hope and prayer that the second coming will come and will come quickly.